Chapter 1. It was a Sunday morning bathed in spring light, the kind that made even the moss on the gravestones of St. Mary Mead Church look cheerful. Birds darted between the budding hedges, and the little bells in the tower chimed with a clarity that carried clean across the cottages of St. Hedwig's Rise. All was as it always had been. Inside the nave, the villagers gathered with their usual blend of faith, habit, and faint nosiness. Mr. and Mrs. Colthorpe arrived fashionably late, flustering as always into the second pew. Edwin Spence held the hymn book too tightly, his eyes flicking nervously toward the altar, while old Miss Penelope Hart brought the same artificial lilies she brought every Palm Sunday. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in the fourth pew to the left, adjusted her gloves with quiet precision. She looked neither bored nor devout, merely observant, as if her mind followed the rhythm of the choir, while noting the incongruity in the dust on the window ledges. But it was the third pew on the right that drew her glance, not once, but twice. It was empty. This in itself might not have concerned an outsider. But in a village like St. Mary Mead, certain habits were ironclad. Pew assignments were not official, but no one dared challenge them. The third pew on the right had been occupied by Colonel Arthur Lucius since his return from India in 1936. He had never once missed a Sunday, not for snow, not for gout, not even during the great flood that had swept through the lower fields 2 years ago, and yet this morning that seat remained disturbingly vacant. Miss Marple said nothing, but she noticed the faint ripple in the congregation. People whispered behind gloved hands. The vicar's eyes flicked toward the pew twice during the sermon. Even Miss Hart paused in her humming of Rock of Ages. After the service, the usual garden chatter failed to resume in its usual rhythm. The tea and seed cakes provided by Mrs. Ridgely were barely touched. Instead, questions buzzed like wasps under a summer glass. Was he ill, you think? He always calls Dr. Stokes if there's a cold, doesn't he? Could be he's gone up to London, though on a Sunday. No one saw his bicycle this morning either. Miss Marple accepted her tea and listened, as only she could, with that slight tilt of the head that invited confidences and rarely offered her own. But it wasn't until little James Whittaker, the vicar's 8-year-old grandson, came running from the side path behind the churchyard that the whisper turned to a shiver. "Mummy," he cried breathlessly, his cheeks red and scraped, "there's someone asleep in the Colonel's garden." The crowd turned as one. "Asleep?" asked Mrs. Ridgely, her teacup frozen mid-air. James nodded. "Under the lilac tree. I saw his boots, but he's not moving." Miss Marple placed her cup neatly on its saucer. "I think," she said with characteristic calm, "that someone should fetch Dr. Stokes at once." 10 minutes later, the vicar's housekeeper, the doctor, and 3 local men returned from the Colonel's property. Faces pale, movements subdued, Dr. Stokes confirmed what Miss Marple already suspected. Colonel Arthur Lucius was dead. No visible wound, no sign of struggle. Just a man, well dressed in his Sunday best, slumped peacefully beneath the lilac in his own walled garden. His cane had been set beside him, and one glove remained on. "A heart attack, most likely," the doctor said, though his tone lacked the confidence of finality. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Perhaps," she murmured, "and yet I wonder." Later that evening, in her sitting room, adorned with lace doilies, faded roses, and a crackling fire. Miss Marple took out her knitting, but she didn't cast on. Instead, she stared out the window toward the darkened outline of St. Mary Mead steeple. A man so punctual, so precise, did not simply wander into his own garden and die without reason. And a man like Colonel Lucius, she remembered, never sat beneath the lilac tree. Not on Sundays, not on any day at all. That had always been his late wife's spot, and he loathed it. Before moving next, Detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments. And if you crave more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file is even darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2. The following morning, the village awoke beneath a pale sky, dappled with uncertain light. A soft drizzle tapped at the windows of St. Mary Mead, as if nature herself hesitated to disturb the quiet gloom settling over the lanes and hedgerows. By breakfast, the news had spread completely. Colonel Lucius was dead. Mrs. Price at the post office spoke of nothing else, pausing mid-measure of stamps to ask the baker's boy if he had heard, though of course she already knew he had. At the grocer's, old Mr. Willoughby claimed to have seen the colonel walking toward the meadow gate just the day before. "Didn't look unwell to me," he insisted, stood straight as a chimney brush. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took her morning walk in a modest lavender coat and weathered shoes, her path winding, perhaps coincidentally, past the colonel's ivy-laced cottage. The gate had been closed. The lilac tree bowed slightly with rain. Through the hedges she noted the garden looked strangely undisturbed. No marks in the soil, no broken branches where he might have fallen. The cane had been retrieved, but its absence from the scene nagged at her. Someone had tied it. That much was clear. She did not linger. Miss Marple never trespassed. But she did notice the small detail others might not. A child's footprint in the damp soil beside the back fence, leading away, not toward the scene. Back at her cottage, she found her nephew Raymond's letter, waiting in the Morning Post. Normally, she would sit with a cup of tea and read it leisurely. Buns at the vicarage. Did you know he planted those lilacs himself after his wife passed? Hardly a sign of grief, muttered Edwin Spence, who had a fondness for brooding remarks. More like guilt. The vicar, Reverend Ames, frowned gently. Now, let's not speak ill of the dead. Colonel Lucius was a man of principle. To a fault, someone added. Miss Marple sipped her tea. The tone had shifted already. The village was preparing to forgive him, which meant, though they wouldn't say it aloud, that something in them suspected there was something to forgive. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a call from Inspector Crale of the county police, a man in his 50s, short-tempered and resistant to subtleties. He had encountered Miss Marple before, and considered her both an asset and a menace, depending on the hour. "I don't expect anything suspicious here," he began. "No wounds, no obvious signs of foul play. But I've learned, Miss Marple, that if you so much as blink twice, someone ends up confessing a murder." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Surely not every time, Inspector." There was a pause. "Did you notice anything off then?" Only the Colonel Lucius never sat under the lilac tree. He loathed it, I believe. Did he now? Humph. Another pause. He was wearing gloves, yes? One, the left, Well, the other was in his jacket pocket. Handkerchief, too, knit as you like. Miss Marple's fingers paused mid-knit, each in his pocket, yes. She didn't comment further, but something shifted behind her eyes. The kind of stillness that marked the first click of understanding, though she said nothing of it yet. Late in the afternoon, she visited Mrs. Ridgely, who had taken on the informal role of village historian and gossip archivist, a plump woman with too many knitted shawls and an unquenchable thirst for information. "It's all terribly shocking, isn't it?" she gushed, placing a plate of ginger biscuits in front of Miss Marple. "I mean, he looked so well on Saturday, nodded to me outside the greengrocer. I even remember what he bought, green apples and a jar of pickled onions." Miss Marple nibbled politely. "Did he say anything?" Mrs. Ridgely frowned. "Oh, yes, actually. Odd thing. He asked if I knew whether anyone had moved into the Osgood cottage. Said he saw lights there late last week." Miss Marple raised a brow. The Osgood cottage had been unoccupied for months. "Perhaps just local boys," Mrs. Ridgely added quickly. "But he seemed, well, not worried exactly. Curious." Curious, Miss Marple noted, was not a word often applied to Colonel Lucius. Suspicious, perhaps. Judgmental, certainly. But curious, no, that was new. As the light faded and the drizzle returned, Miss Marple paused at the gates of St. Mary Mead. The pew remained empty, of course. The interior was locked until choir rehearsal tomorrow evening. She placed a gloved hand on the cold iron bar and looked at the darkened church beyond. The colonel had left no note, no sign of pain or panic. Just a body beneath the tree he had once refused to sit beneath, dressed in his best and with one glove neatly stored in his pocket. Too neat, and that, Miss Marple thought, was the most suspicious thing of all. Chapter 3. Tuesday dawned with sharper winds and clearer skies, an unforgiving sort of brightness that seemed to expose the imperfections of everything it touched. Ivy clung like claws to brickwork. The narrow streets of St. Mary Mead bustled just a little more than usual, as if activity might stifle the unease hanging in the air. At the vicarage, preparations for the upcoming church fete were continuing, on the surface at least. The bake sale volunteers had thinned, the bunting committee met in subdued tones, and even the typically exuberant Mrs. Price had forgotten her lemon tart recipe for the first time in 15 years. Miss Marple took none of this lightly. She knew the village well enough to recognize that such forgetfulness did not come from grief, but from preoccupation. And fear, however polite, was a very effective silencer. It was just past noon when Dora Pilch, the milkmaid's niece, and a girl of about 11, came knocking on Miss Marple's door. A nervous child by nature, Dora often lurked near fences rather than approach houses directly. So her sudden appearance on the front step, with a red face, wind-whipped plaits and mud-specked stockings, was noteworthy in itself. "Miss Marple," she whispered, casting a glance over her shoulder, "there's someone in the Osgood cottage." Miss Marple set aside her teacup. "Someone? A man. Saw him through the back window. He was lighting the stove. He's got dark hair and a long coat, and he don't look like he belongs here." Miss Marple did not smile, as she often might with children. Instead, she leaned forward slightly. "Did he see you?" Dora shook her head fiercely. "No, ma'am. I was just passing. Took the side path." "And you're quite certain it wasn't a caretaker or inspector?" No one ever goes there. Mummy says it's been empty since the war. Thank you, Dora. You were very wise to come and tell me. Miss Marple fetched a small biscuit tin from the cabinet and let Dora choose one before sending her off with strict instructions not to mention the matter to anyone else, not even her aunt. Half an hour later, Miss Marple stood just beyond the hedgerow that separated the overgrown back lane from the Osgood property. The cottage, though modest, had an air of quiet melancholy. Boarded windows at the front, ivy gone wild, shutters warped with age, but from the chimney, unmistakably, smoke now rose in thin grey strands. A faint sound reached her ear. Footsteps. Slow. Intentional. She moved away before she could be spotted. At tea that afternoon, Miss Marple brought up the cottage, but only indirectly. I passed near Osgood's old place today. Such a pity it's been left so long. Strange, really, that no one's claimed it. Reverend A. Marple said mildly. Neither of them asked how she knew about the smoke. Meanwhile, Inspector Crail had received the post-mortem report from Dr. Stokes. He did not immediately share its contents with the public, but his brief conversation with the vicar was enough to send fresh ripples through the community. He said it was not entirely natural. The vicar told Miss Marple the following morning, wouldn't elaborate. That evening, a second policeman arrived in the village. Not long after, a constable was posted discreetly near the colonel's cottage. On Wednesday, just before the inquest, something entirely unexpected occurred. Mrs. Ruth Ellery, widowed schoolmistress, quiet as wallpaper, known for nothing more than her rigid timetables and a fondness for marmalade, came to Miss Marple's cottage. "I shouldn't be here," she said in a hushed voice, hands trembling over the handle of her handbag. Miss Marple ushered her inside without question. "I saw something," Ruth said, "Sunday morning, just before church." Her voice dropped. "A man climbing over the colonel's fence from the lane." Miss Marple sat very still. "Did you recognize him?" "No," Ruth said quickly. "Only his coat, grey, long, a walking coat like my brother used to wear." "Was he carrying anything?" Ruth hesitated. "A small parcel, about the size of a book, wrapped in paper." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Have you told anyone else?" "No. I was afraid it would seem like gossip, but I haven't been able to sleep since." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand over hers. "You were right to come." By the time the inquest concluded, the village had changed again. The verdict was postponed. Cause of death was now listed as pending toxicology. Colonel Lucius, it seemed, had not died of natural causes after all. And though no one said the word aloud, they all knew what it meant. Poison Gertrude. Chapter 4. Thursday began with a cold snap, the kind that made garden gates stick and teacups steam more than usual. By mid-morning, the villagers of St. Mary Mead had collectively accepted what they now whispered with growing certainty. Colonel Arthur Lucius had been murdered. The news did not explode. It seeped like tea through linen. Mrs. Price, in the post office, had taken to lowering her voice, even when entirely alone. Reverend Ames shortened his sermons. The Colonel's gardener, Mr. Fellows, was seen hammering shut the potting shed with unnecessary force, and Mrs. Hart, who once claimed to have danced with Prince George at a naval ball, now walked past the Colonel's gate with her head down. Even the birds seemed quieter. But Miss Marple, while respectful of grief, believed in forward motion. So when she received a knock just after 10, she opened her door without hesitation. It was Inspector Crale. He did not remove his hat. "Mind if I trouble you for a moment, Miss Marple?" "Of course, Inspector. Come in." He entered stiffly, surveying the lace-covered furniture and the neat stacks of correspondence with the air of someone walking into a room more intelligent than he was comfortable with. He remained standing. "We've identified a substance," he said flatly. "Digitalis, extract of foxglove, slow-acting, found in the stomach, trace amounts in the bloodstream." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused, but only for a beat. "A cultivated poison," she said softly. "Common in cottage gardens. Easy to mask in. Strong tea." Crale nodded. He'd had no breakfast that morning, according to the maid. Just a cup of tea before church. And the teacup was rinsed and put away. Maid swears she didn't touch it, assumed he took it with him. But it wasn't found in the garden. No cup. No cup. Miss Marple set her needles aside. A strange man appears at the Osgood cottage. A woman sees someone climbing the Colonel's fence before church. And now a missing teacup. She looked up. "You're not here to share, Inspector. You're here to ask." He exhaled slowly. Did the Colonel have enemies?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Colonel Lucius had principles, Inspector, and principles, when rigid, often masquerade as cruelty. He embarrassed the vicar over the choir budget, reported Edwin Spence's brother for trespassing on railway grounds, refused to speak to Mrs. Hart for 4 years after a disagreement over chrysanthemums. Not exactly motive for murder." "No," she agreed, "but it paints a portrait, and portraits, when viewed from the right distance, reveal character." Crale blinked. "I'll leave you to it, Miss Marple." She rose to see him out. Later that day, Miss Marple made an appearance at the village antique fair, an event long planned, but now possessed of an awkward undercurrent. Stalls stood arranged around the parish hall, filled with tarnished silverware, chipped crockery, and second-hand novels bound with twine. Miss Marple took her time. At one of the smaller tables, she was greeted by Miss Gwen Clark, a quiet woman who had returned to the village after years away in Bath. She had been a student once, before the war, and now lived alone, renting a room above the grocer's. They exchanged pleasantries, and Miss Marple allowed her gaze to drift over the items on display. A worn clock, a framed portrait, a silver spoon set, and near the edge, almost tucked beneath a folded doily, a pocket watch, old brass, the chain broken, the lid engraved with the faint initials. A.L. Miss Marple's fingers brushed it lightly. "This watch?" she asked gently. "Where did it come from?" Miss Clark looked up, momentarily unsure. "Oh, that? Someone brought it in anonymously. Left it with the vicar's assistant yesterday. Said it was part of the donations from the Colonel's cottage." "But the Colonel had no close family here." "No, but it's his, isn't it? Those are his initials." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "They are." She turned the watch over. The clasp had a slight smudge, polished hastily, but not well. Miss Marple, years ago, when she'd worked as a companion in her household. That night, Miss Marple placed the broken watch on her table beside the fire, and looked at it in silence. Someone, she thought, had meant it to be found. Ear message, or A misstep. She recalled Ruth Ellery's description again. A grey coat, a parcel the size of a book. Had the package contained the watch? Had someone returned it, perhaps under the illusion of cleaning their conscience? If so, they had done the opposite. At exactly 9 o'clock, a knock came at the door. This time it was Reverend Ames. He looked agitated. "I've had a letter," he said, pulling it from his coat. Slipped under the church door. Miss Marple took it with gloved hands. It was unsigned. Inside, on a single sheet of cream paper, was written, "Ask who really sat in the Colonel's pew last Sunday." Chapter 5. The next morning brought with it an air of brittle expectancy. St. Mary Mead seemed to pause between breaths, as if the village itself were waiting for something to break. Miss Marple rose early. She had not slept deeply. The unsigned letter left at the church had stirred a particular disquiet in her. Not fear, but a sharpened awareness that someone else in the village was observing just as closely as she was. Someone who knew that a question asked at the right moment was far more dangerous than an answer. Ask who really sat in the Colonel's pew last Sunday. It wasn't just a riddle, it was a challenge. By 10 o'clock, Miss Marple had paid a polite visit to the vicarage. Reverend Ames, still visibly shaken from the anonymous note, handed over the original envelope. Though it bore no postmark, it had been slipped through the church door some time after dark. "I thought it might be from a child playing games," he said, "but now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. No childish game. Whoever wrote this had very precise timing, and something to hide. She turned the envelope in her hand. The handwriting was neat, unremarkable, and the paper, smooth, high-quality stock, suggested someone educated, someone who didn't intend to leave fingerprints in any sense of the word. Later that day, she met Mrs. Ridgely on the path outside the grocer's. "I was just thinking about that dreadful business," the older woman said without prompting. "The Colonel's death. I mean, so sudden, but you know, I did think something was odd that morning at church." Miss Marple let her speak. "Well, it's just, when I arrived I was running a touch late, only by a minute, and I passed the Colonel's pew, of course. I glanced in, you see, because it's always a comfort, his presence. But I thought, just for a second, I saw someone leaving it. Leaving? Yes, a man, I think, walking toward the side vestibule. I assumed it was the Colonel himself going to stretch his legs or something, but now, did you see his face?" "No," she said, frowning. "He was already turning away, but I noticed something strange." She paused, lowering her voice. "He wasn't wearing gloves." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Odd, in this weather." "Exactly. And the Colonel always wore gloves. Brown leather ones. Old military habit, I suppose." Miss Marple tucked that detail into her growing mental map. Someone had been in that pew before the service began. Someone who wanted to be seen but not recognized. And they had left something behind. A trace, perhaps. A scent. A wrinkle in the seat cushion. A lie embedded in silence. That evening, Miss Marple visited Inspector Crail under the guise of offering him a jar of quince jam. He accepted it with great suspicion, but allowed her inside his temporary quarters at the inn. "There's something about the pew," she said after a few minutes of idle talk. "May I ask, did you happen to inspect it?" Crail blinked. "The pew? Yes. The Colonel's, after the service." "Well, not immediately." He frowned. "I had it checked yesterday, actually, after you mentioned that peculiar business with the watch." "Why, was anything found?" He hesitated. "A woman's glove, right side, silk, no initials, pale grey. Not the Colonel's, then?" "Obviously not." Miss Marple smiled. "And was it dusty?" He blinked. "Dusty? The pew. If no one had sat there at all, one might expect some dust on the seat. But if someone had brushed against it—" Crail stared at her. "There was a mark," he admitted. "A slight smudge, left side of the cushion. But the Colonel was found with his glove on his left hand," Miss Marple finished, "which means the smudge cannot be from him." There was a pause. Crail scratched his chin. "So someone sat there deliberately, and then vanished." "Or hid," Miss Marple said gently. The following day brought a quiet stir when Gwen Clark failed to open her antique stall. A note pinned to the grocer's corkboard read, "Due to illness, Miss Clark will not be in attendance this week." Miss Marple made no comment, but she did pay a brief visit to the grocer, where she inquired offhandedly whether anyone had collected parcels on Miss Clark's behalf. "Only yesterday," said Mr. Fulcher. "One of her old books had come back, from binding. A gentleman picked it up. Tall fellow, dark coat. Said he was a relative." "Miss Clark has no known relatives," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Well, I assumed he was speaking loosely." The grocer shrugged. "Looked like the scholarly sort." Miss Marple thanked him and left. A tall man in a grey coat, a parcel the size of a book, a false alibi delivered through quiet routine. That evening the second knock came. This time it was Dora Pilch again, muddy, breathless, and wide-eyed. "I saw him again," she whispered. "The man in the coat, in the lane behind the Colonel's garden." The watch returned anonymously. The glove left in the pew. The digging behind a lilac. And then she underlined the note. Ask who really sat in the Colonel's pew. Because now, she thought, she knew who it wasn't. And soon she would know exactly who it had to be. Chapter 6. By the next morning, the clouds above St. Mary Mead hung lower, greyer, as though burdened with secrets of their own. Inspector Crail was already pacing the Colonel's back garden when Miss Marple arrived unannounced at the gate, her hat pinned tightly against the wind and a faint smile on her lips. "I heard," she said, without needing to explain what. "You found something." Then Crail gave her a long, unreadable look. Then he stepped aside. "Come see for yourself." 2 constables stood near the lilac tree, boots pressed into the damp earth. A section of soil, perhaps 2 feet across, had been freshly disturbed. The spade, standard issue, no markings, lay abandoned by the fence. At the centre of the shallow pit, wrapped in layers of oilcloth and tied with string, sat a modest-sized tin box. Crail folded his arms. "We opened it 20 minutes ago. Thought you might want to hear before word gets out." He nodded to one of the constables, who gently lifted the lid. Inside, packed in cotton and yellowed tissue, lay a pair of ladies' gloves, pearl-coloured and delicate, a locket cracked open to reveal a miniature portrait, a letter folded and refolded so many times the creases had nearly torn through. And at the bottom, a brooch, Art Deco, with a missing sapphire. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then, very softly, "Items belonging to Mrs. Lucius." Crail glanced at her. "You're certain?" She was fond of Art Deco. "And the locket's portrait, it's of her. Younger, perhaps, but unmistakably her." He exhaled. "That matches what the Colonel's housekeeper told us years ago. Several of her keepsakes went missing after her funeral. They assumed it was a thief, or perhaps the Colonel himself disposing of painful memories." Miss Marple turned to the disturbed soil. And yet here they were, not destroyed, not pawned, hidden. She paused, eyes narrowing. Buried under the tree she loved. And he hated. Crail frowned. He hated the tree. Miss Marple nodded. He couldn't bear to sit beneath it after her death. He told the vicar once that the scent made him ill. The inspector knelt to examine the brooch more closely. "So why bury her belongings here?" "That," Miss Marple said, "is precisely the question." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Ruth Ellery once more. The former schoolmistress opened the door with the air of someone caught between fear and expectation. "I wondered," Miss Marple said gently, "if I might trouble you again about what you saw on Sunday morning." Ruth hesitated, then stepped aside. They sat in the modest sitting-room, its walls lined with books and framed certificates from decades past. "It was only for a moment," Ruth said. "He dropped down behind the fence and moved toward the garden. I couldn't see clearly." "Did he carry anything?" "A bag, I think, slung across his back." Miss Marple nodded. "And the coat, long, grey, worn-looking, but neat, like something an academic might wear." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Miss Ellery, did you know that Gwen Clark worked for the Colonel's wife before the war?" The question seemed to rattle Ruth. "Yes," she said slowly, "though she doesn't talk about it. She left the village abruptly after Mrs. Lucius died." "Did she ever speak of her relationship with the Colonel?" Ruth shook her head. "Only that it was strained. She didn't say why." Miss Marple gave a slight smile. She wouldn't have had to. Some silences are very loud. That evening, Miss Marple returned home and laid the letter from the tin box on her writing desk. It had been handed to her by Crail earlier under the condition of confidentiality. It was addressed in an unfamiliar hand, to the one who might understand. Inside was a single page, unsigned. The writing was clipped and mechanical, as though the words had been forced out reluctantly. "I did not kill her, but I let her die. I watched her fall and did nothing. It was easier that way. I was tired of the accusations, the endless suspicion. She was always watching me, always testing. I buried her things so no one else would find them. If you're reading this, then I am likely gone too. Perhaps I'll be forgiven, but I doubt it." Miss Marple read it twice, then a third time, slower. Something in the phrasing struck her. Not, "I killed her," but "I let her die." It wasn't murder. It was omission, complicity, cowardice. A confession not of action, but of inaction. And yet, Colonel Lucius had been poisoned by someone with more motive than guilt, someone who knew of the hiding place, someone who unearthed the box, perhaps to retrieve the letter, or perhaps to expose it. But why return the items only now? Why, unless the timing had become urgent? unless someone feared that the truth, once buried, was about to be lost forever. That night, Miss Marple wrote a note of her own. It was brief and precise, and she delivered it herself, slipping it under the door of the small room above the grocer's. Meet me in the south churchyard at dusk. Bring nothing. Come alone. She knew Gwen Clark would come, because guilt was not something easily ignored in St. Mary Mead, and secrets had long memories. Chapter 7. Evening fell like a velvet curtain across St. Mary Mead. A hush settled over the village that was not simply the stillness of twilight, but something older, more watchful. As the sun dipped behind the steeple of St. Mary Mead, the south churchyard, more overgrown than the front, less visited, took on a solemn hush. Miss Marple stood near the crumbling statue of St. Agnes. Always did get the better of me. There was no smile in her voice. They stood in silence a moment longer, the only sound the soft rustling of ivy against the stone wall. Miss Marple spoke first. "You buried the box beneath the lilac tree." Gwen looked away. "No," she said. "I dug it up." Miss Marple waited. Gwen exhaled. "It was never mine to begin with. I didn't even know it was there. Not until 2 weeks ago. And yet you returned the pocket watch." "That was different," Gwen said, her voice tightening. "I found it in the lining of a coat the Colonel gave me before he became ill. Said it was for donation. I thought it should be returned." "To where?" "Why, the antique fair. I didn't want to be seen. I left it with the vicar's assistant anonymously. I hoped it would end up where it belonged." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And the box?" "I saw someone digging," Gwen said, "late at night, near the lilac. I didn't know who. But the next morning I went to look, and it was still there, half buried. I took it. I opened it. And then I panicked." Her voice cracked then, just slightly. "It was her jewelry, her letter. I remembered the brooch. She wore it the day before she died. She trusted me." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "You thought the Colonel had taken them?" "I knew he had." Gwen's eyes gleamed, furious with old restraint. "He made her life unbearable. He accused her of having affairs, of stealing from him. He humiliated her at every turn. She once confided in me that she thought he might kill her. And then she died. A fall," Gwen spat. "Down the stairs. No bruises, no signs of a struggle. But I never believed it, and neither did she, not really. She used to say, 'If anything happens, tell them to check the pew.' I never understood what she meant." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the stone beside her. "Why didn't you come forward?" Gwen's voice was hollow now. "Because I thought it would do no good. Because I had no proof. Because I was afraid." She looked up at Miss Marple, the lines on her face stark in the fading light. "And then he died, and I thought, perhaps the village deserves to know. Perhaps she deserves to be remembered for who she was. I buried the box again, left the note at the church. I thought that would be enough. But someone else had already seen you digging." Gwen closed her eyes. "Who?" "I don't yet know," Miss Marple said honestly. "But they wore a long grey coat, and they've tried very hard to stay invisible." Gwen's mouth tightened. "You think they killed him?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately, I think. she said at last, that they had a reason to. The following morning, Inspector Crail summoned Miss Marple to the Colonel's cottage once more. "There's been a development," he said, gesturing her toward the study. "Housekeeper came across this tucked behind some old gardening books." Here, held out a small cracked leather notebook. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly. Inside were brief, clipped entries, mostly notes on parish meetings, gardening tasks, and household accounts. But 3 pages stood out. March 14th. G. Clark, snooping. Again. Must have seen her at the hedge. Foolish woman. Won't make trouble. March 17th. Letter. Gone. Who moved it? March 20th. I saw him again. Grey coat. Watching from the lane. Not the same man from before. Not from the village. Miss Marple read the last line twice. Then she closed the book. Not from the village, she murmured. Then who? Crail crossed his arms. Could be someone from the Colonel's past. Military, foreign post. He had enemies, I'm sure, or family. Crail looked puzzled. He had no close relatives. No acknowledged relatives, Miss Marple corrected. There is a difference. She handed the notebook back. Tell me, Inspector, have you heard of a man named Daniel Wire? Crail frowned. No. He lived briefly at the Osgood cottage last year. A quiet sort. Claimed to be writing a novel. But I've since learned he inquired, discreetly, into the Lucius estate records. You think he's connected? Think he wore a grey coat? And I think he might be the one who returned to the cottage this month. Crail's brow furrowed. We'll look into him. But what's his motive? Miss Marple's smile was faint. That, she said, is what I intend to ask him. Chapter 8. The name Daniel Wire was not one that circulated easily in St. Mary Mead. Few villagers remembered him clearly. Only that a man with dark hair and an unreadable face had rented the Osgood cottage for 5 months the previous year. He kept odd hours, spoke little, and, according to Mrs. Price at the post office, sent more letters than he received. He said he was writing a novel, she had once remarked, but I never saw him buy a single sheet of paper. All his envelopes were reused, and then one day he had vanished. No goodbye, no notice, just an empty cottage and a note left for the landlord. Change of plans, not returning. Keep the deposit. Miss Marple now found herself seated in the study of Inspector Crail once again, facing a small stack of documents recently recovered from county records at her discreet urging. There, she said, tapping a faded file with a slender finger. That one. Crail opened it. Daniel Wire, 38, unmarried, former civil servant, discharged under quiet circumstances 3 years ago. Had lived in 4 counties in 5 years. Moved often, didn't he? Crail muttered. Yes, Miss Marple replied, and none of his neighbours in those counties remember him doing any writing. So not a novelist. No. Crail scanned the page. There's something here. Mother. Constance Wire, deceased. No father listed. Born in Dorset. Afternoon. Miss Marple made her way to the now sealed Osgood cottage. It was padlocked by police order, but the path behind it, leading towards the hedgerow and the Colonel's garden, remained open. She followed it slowly, her eyes scanning the ground with quiet precision. There were still faint marks where the spade had disturbed the soil, but farther along, just before the fence turned into thicker woods, something caught her eye. A matchbook, dampened by weather but intact. She knelt and turned it over. Hawthorne Arms, Little Marchbury. Not a local pub. 20 miles off. She slipped it into her handbag. That evening, Miss Marple made one more call, this time to the vicarage. She found Reverend Ames finishing supper, and asked if she might speak to his wife. Mrs. Ames, a mild woman who rarely ventured beyond her garden gate, welcomed her with some surprise. "I wondered," Miss Marple said delicately, "if you happened to recall a man attending services last year. A stranger, grey coat, quiet demeanour, sat near the back, came and went during autumn, then stopped." Mrs. Ames blinked. "Yes," she said slowly. "I do remember someone like that. He never joined the tea afterward. Always seemed to watch more than listen." Miss Marple nodded. "Did you ever catch his name?" "No, but once he left a book behind. A novel, The Shadowed Path. I thought he'd return for it, but he never did. Do you still have it?" Mrs. Ames stood and fetched it from a nearby shelf. The cover was creased, pages underlined in pencil. Inside the front was a faint signature G. J. By Friday morning, Inspector Crail was en route to Little Marchbury. Miss Marple remained in the village, following a different thread. She returned to the antique fair, not to browse, but to speak with Gwen Clark one final time. "I must ask you something personal," Miss Marple said as they stood behind a lace-covered table of brass frames. Gwen glanced at her warily. "Go on." "Did Mrs. Lucius ever speak of her past? Before her marriage?" Gwen frowned. "Only once. She mentioned that before marrying the Colonel she had been engaged, briefly, but the man's family opposed it." "Did she say a name?" "No, only that he left for India. She called it a mercy in disguise." Miss Marple nodded. "Did the Colonel know?" Gwen hesitated. "She said he did, that he found out after their wedding. She said he never forgave her." There it was again. Not anger, not sorrow, resentment, the slow, cold drip of long-held grievance. By dusk, a wire arrived from Inspector Crail. Located subject at Hawthorne Arms. Confirmed identity. Cooperative but guarded. Will return to village tomorrow for questioning. Crail. Miss Marple folded the telegram and placed it beside her knitting. The storm was moving inward now, not toward chaos, but toward clarity. Daniel Wire had come searching for truth, but someone else, someone within the village, had been searching for silence. And it was silence, after all, that Miss Marple distrusted most. That night she stood again near the empty pew at St. Mary Mead. The wind through the rafters was sharp, carrying with it the smell of candle wax and stone. She reached out and touched the wood gently. Someone had sat there just before the service, someone who had wanted to be seen, but not remembered. A woman's glove had been left behind, a misleading trail, a red herring in silk, because it wasn't just Daniel Wire who had worn a grey coat that week. There was another, quieter, smarter, and perhaps more dangerous. Chapter 9. Saturday morning arrived with a brittle sky, and a sharpness in the air that felt more like autumn than spring. The village of St. Mary Mead stirred cautiously, its people quietly aware that Inspector Crail was expected to return before lunch. This time, with a visitor who might know far more than he cared to admit. Miss Marple, however, was not waiting at the constabulary. Instead, she stood in the back room of the vicarage, seated across from Ruth Ellery, for the second time in a week. The former schoolmistress had received Miss Marple's note with visible anxiety, but she had come. She always came. "You asked me once," Miss Marple began gently, "who the man was you saw climbing the Colonel's fence. I think you may have mistaken the question." Ruth tilted her head slightly, confusion flickering behind her eyes. Miss Marple continued, "Because what we assumed, what I allowed to be assumed, was that the figure in the grey coat was a man. But you never saw his face. You saw a coat. You saw movement. You assumed." Ruth blinked. "It was tall, the figure, broad-shouldered, and moving quickly, in dim light, in the rain, and likely with purpose. We see what we expect to see, Miss Ellery. But I've been reviewing your words carefully, and you never said man. You said someone. I asked if you recognized them, and you said no." Ruth swallowed hard. "Then you think—" "I think the red herring in this case wasn't just a glove. It was the notion of a single suspect, a single interloper. But the real danger always lives closer to the hearth." Inspector Crail returned to St. Mary Mead at exactly 11:45, accompanied by Daniel Wire. The man who stepped out of the car was neither sinister nor stooped with secrets. He looked tired, plainly dressed, pale-eyed, and lean with the kind of watchfulness that doesn't come from guilt, but from a life spent watching others pretend. He was brought to the station quietly. No handcuffs, no official statement. Just a private conversation in Crail's office. Miss Marple was not present. She did not need to be. She already knew what Daniel Wire would say. He had come to St. Mary Mead when he left suddenly. It was because of something simpler than confrontation. "I couldn't forgive him," he told Crail, "and I couldn't talk to a man I'd already tried and condemned in my heart." "Sir, did you return?" Crail asked. Wire shook his head. "Not until last week. I heard he had died. I came to see if there was anything I should know. I didn't go inside the house. I stood in the garden. I saw someone digging. I left." He gave no alibi for the day of the Colonel's death, except to say he had been in Little Marchbury the entire weekend, alone. And so far, no one could prove otherwise. Miss Marple, meanwhile, paid a visit to Gwen Clark. It was not announced. She found Gwen tending a stack of linens at the back of her modest shop, eyes hollow and lips pressed thin. "I imagine you've heard," Miss Marple said softly. Gwen nodded. "He's here, Daniel Wire," Miss Marple continued. "But he's not who you think." "I don't know what to think any more." "You think he returned for vengeance?" "But he didn't. He returned because he wanted to understand who he was. And in doing so, he saw someone else returning too." Gwen stilled. "Someone familiar," Miss Marple continued. "Someone who buried that tin box years ago. Someone who remembered precisely where to find it. Someone who wanted us to find it now." Silence stretched between them, and then quietly Gwen said, "Ruth." Miss Marple nodded once. "She was the companion before you, wasn't she? For a short time." Mrs. Lucius dismissed her, but she never said why. "And Ruth never forgave her for it," Gwen whispered. "She called her smug, said she put on airs, that the Colonel deserved better. She told me she saw a man climbing the fence that morning, Miss Marple said, but she saw no such thing, because she was the one in the grey coat. That evening, Inspector Crail came to Miss Marple's cottage with a telegram in his hand. "She's gone," he said. "Ellery, left by the early train, left a note for the vicar, taking a holiday." Miss Marple read the telegram. "What you see was from Bath, a room rented in her name, paid in advance." "She's not hiding," Miss Marple said quietly. "Not yet. She's waiting to see if the net will tighten." Crail frowned. "Do you think she did it?" Miss Marple gave him a long, steady look. "I think she poisoned his tea, and I think she left that glove in the pew, not to implicate herself, but to confuse the timeline." Crail looked grim. "And the motive?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Resentment, Inspector. Years of it. She blamed Mrs. Lutyus for her dismissal, blamed the Colonel for never defending her, and when she saw Daniel Wire return, so much like his mother by the look of him, it brought it all back. She feared exposure. Or perhaps she simply couldn't bear the past being disturbed." Crail looked down at the note again. "She didn't leave the village to escape justice," Miss Marple said calmly. "She's hoping justice will forget her." Chapter 10. The absence of Ruth Ellery was not spoken of loudly in St. Mary Mead. People noticed, of course. They always noticed. Her curtained windows, usually drawn back with tidy precision each morning, remained closed. No footsteps echoed across the cobblestones to the grocer's. No clipped remarks about the vicar's sermon or the quality of the village preserves, but rather than dwell on the mystery, the village simply adjusted, because that, Miss Marple often thought, was what small communities did best when unease loomed too close to home. They polished the surface and swept the cracks under the rug. Inspector Crail had sent Ruth's photo and information to surrounding stations, requesting surveillance of train lines and boarding houses. But Miss Marple knew Ruth wouldn't run. Not properly. She was too proud for panic and too practical for chaos. "She'll wait," Miss Marple told him. "Wait until she believes the dust has settled. That's how bitterness survives, Inspector. It burrows in, not bursts out." Crail exhaled through his nose. "So we do nothing?" "We prepare," she said gently, "because Ruth isn't finished. Not quite." That evening Miss Marple attended evensong. It was not something she did every Saturday, but she believed in patterns. And she believed in the small shifts that occurred when routines changed. The pews were only half filled. The air inside St. Mary Mead held a tentative quiet, as if even the stones themselves were waiting. Reverend Ames gave a modest reading. The organ wheezed once. No one spoke afterward, but Miss Marple noticed what was missing. The cough Ruth always stifled during the third hymn. The rustle of her handbag being set precisely on the pew cushion. The cue, where she stood a half-second early before each reading, as though determined to lead even in obedience. Small things vanished now. And yet, Miss Marple did see one thing out of place. In the very pew Ruth usually occupied, beneath the hymnal, a folded page. She waited until the others had filed out before retrieving it. No address, no signature, only 6 words. "You buried her under that tree." Miss Marple did not take the note to Inspector Crail. Not yet. Instead, she spent Sunday walking the village, speaking to no one, smiling only occasionally, as if considering spring bulbs or the coming fete. But behind her thoughts, something else stirred. An older story, an older crime, one that had never made the headlines. Ruth's bitterness was real. Her resentment was personal. But poison required something more than hatred. It required nerve and access and control. The note in the pew wasn't Ruth's writing. She'd seen Ruth's script on library donation slips and bake sale rosters. No, this was someone who wanted us to think she'd done it. Crail leaned forward. You think we've got the wrong person? I think, Miss Marple said softly, we've been looking at the wrong layer of the crime. She stood. I need a word with Gwen Clark. Gwen was found sweeping the stone steps of the parish hall. She looked up with an expression that flickered between exhaustion and dread. I can't help you, she said before Miss Marple had spoken. I believe you can, Miss Marple replied, stepping closer. You knew Ruth. You truly knew her. And you knew she didn't have the strength to poison a man in cold blood. Gwen hesitated. She hated him. That much is true. Hatred doesn't equate to method, Miss Marple said. The tea was prepared with precision. The dose wasn't clumsy. It was measured, given just enough time to appear natural. That requires planning. Ruth didn't have the mind for it. She had reason. She had rage, Miss Marple corrected. But rage lashes out. This was colder. Gwen looked away. Then who? Miss Marple studied her for a long moment. Someone close enough to the Colonel to know his habits. Someone already dismissed by suspicion. Someone who's been quietly present this entire time, but carefully outside the circle of accusation. Gwen's voice dropped to a whisper. You don't mean... But Miss Marple only nodded once. Miss Hart, it was not a dramatic confrontation. That was never Miss Marple's way. She arrived at Penelope Hart's cottage with a small bouquet of violets and a tin of lemon biscuits. Mrs. Hart was delighted, of course. She always had been fond of polite rituals. They sat for tea, surrounded by lace and old perfume. I was thinking, Miss Marple said between sips, how odd it is that you always use the same pew as the Colonel, just 2 rows behind. Mrs. Hart gave a prim smile. Tradition, my dear, one must be consistent. And that you always left your gloves on the ledge during hymns. An old habit from the opera days. Miss Marple set down her cup. You see, someone left a woman's glove in the Colonel's pew. And the curious thing is, it was identical in style to yours. Mrs. Hart did not blink. Miss Marple continued, I also found your writing on a slip of paper in St. Mary Mead, hidden in a hymnal. 6 words, rather accusatory. Now, Mrs. Hart did blink, just once. Then she smiled again, smaller this time. Well, she said, I suppose I always did prefer my endings neat. Chapter 11. Miss Marple had always said that the most dangerous people in a village weren't the loud ones, but the invisible ones. The women who poured tea, set flowers just so, and said all the right things at precisely the wrong time. Penelope Hart had mastered that performance over a lifetime. Sitting in her sitting room now, her gloved hands folded calmly in her lap, She regarded Miss Marple with an expression that was neither defiant nor ashamed. If anything, it resembled relief. "You've come to accuse me, I suppose," she said, her tone even. "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "I've come to understand you." Mrs. Hart gave a short, brittle laugh. "You always were very theatrical, Jane. All that knitting and tea, when in truth you see everything." Miss Marple remained composed. The glove in the pew, the note in the hymnal. Neither were signs of panic, Mrs. Hart. They were placed, staged. You wanted Ruth Ellery to carry the burden of suspicion. "She was already halfway there," Mrs. Hart said, lifting her chin. "No friends, a grudge, a grey coat. I simply gave the story a little nudge." Miss Marple didn't flinch. "And you buried the box?" "I retrieved it," she corrected. "It was already dug up. I merely ensured it would be found, after the right delay. You were in the garden that night." Mrs. Hart didn't deny it. The lilac tree meant everything to her, you know. Mrs. Lucius. It was her sanctuary, a solace. He loathed it because it reminded him she'd once been happy without him. But I remembered where she liked to sit, where she left things, what she cherished. And so you made it her final revenge." Mrs. Hart's smile was cold. Arthur Lucius ruined lives quietly. He didn't stab people in the dark. He dismissed them, publicly, coldly. Ruth, Gwen, even me. Miss Marple said nothing. "I knew him before the war, you know, briefly, in London. We were close once, before he married that waif and moved here. Afterward, he acted as though we'd never met. Treated me like a stranger. I wasn't his kind of woman anymore. I was too familiar." Her voice trembled then, just once. "Did?" Marple folded her hands in her lap. "You didn't poison him for your own sake. You did it for hers." Mrs. Hart blinked. "Who?" "Mrs. Lucius." Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Mrs. Hart rose. She walked to the window and stood very still. "She used to sing when no one was listening," she said quietly. "Low, in French. I'd heard it once, passing her garden. It was so lovely, so out of place in this drab village. And he shut it all down, crushed it out of her." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "So you waited?" "Yes," she whispered, "all these years." And when Ruth came sniffing again, and Daniel Wire showed up like a ghost from the bloodline, I knew it wouldn't stay buried, not forever." She turned back, a single tear running down one cheek. "I didn't want to get away with it, Jane. Not really. I just didn't want him to win." Miss Marple stood. "You should come with me to the station, Mrs. Hart." Mrs. Hart nodded slowly. "Yes, I suppose I should." Word of the arrest did not spread in the typical fashion. Inspector, following evening, just before sunset, and placed a single white rose beneath the lilac tree. Miss Marple watched from a distance. When he turned and caught her eye, he gave her a small, uncertain nod. She returned it. Then she turned and walked away. The next day, Inspector Crail joined Miss Marple for tea. "You were right about all of it," he said. "She confessed in her own way. Said she slipped the digitalis into his morning tea while pretending to return a pie dish. She knew his maid would never suspect." Miss Marple nodded. "It was carefully done. She used the illusion of routine. She told me she wore the grey coat because she'd seen Daniel in one. She hoped it would muddy the waters." And it did, temporarily. Crail sipped his tea. Do you think she regrets it? No, Miss Marple said. I think she believes she acted justly. That's the most dangerous kind of killer, Inspector, the one who believes they're right. He looked down at the biscuit in his hand, and, You? What do you believe? Miss Marple considered the question for a long moment. I believe justice was done, but not cleanly, not without pain. This wasn't a clever murder, Inspector. It was a slow unravelling. Decades of silences, slights, and dismissed women. Penelope Hart was not born a killer. She was shaped. She looked out the window. Still, murder cannot be excused, no matter how artfully dressed. That evening, the empty pew at St. Mary Mead remained empty. The service continued, the choir sang, and the villagers bowed their heads as if nothing had changed. But Miss Marple noticed how the silence felt different now. Heavier, permanent, not just the absence of the Colonel, but of all that had followed him. Chapter 12. A week after Penelope Hart's quiet arrest, spring arrived in earnest. The hedgerows thickened with blossom, the sky softened into a deeper blue, and a fragile warmth settled over St. Mary Mead. The Felt Committee resumed their meetings. The parish hall reopened its doors, and in the minds of many, life gently moved forward. But Miss Marple knew better than to believe in clean transitions. Crimes leave behind more than bodies and statements. They leave absences, shapes carved out of the everyday. A teacup never retrieved, a conversation never had again, a seat never taken. She stood now at the edge of St. Mary Mead nave, her hands resting lightly on the curved back of the Colonel's once-occupied pew. No one had taken it since. Even with the mystery solved, no one dared. Perhaps they feared the shadow of judgment still lingered there, or perhaps Miss Marple thought it wasn't judgment they feared, but truth. Inspector Crail met her for lunch at the village inn. He looked more relaxed than he had in weeks, still wary, but no longer carrying the tension of unfinished work. I got the final lab results, he said between forkfuls of mutton pie. The dosage in the tea matched what we found in the Colonel's bloodstream. Lethal but untraceable in smell. Digitalis, as you said. It would have tasted bitter, but masked well in strong Darjeeling. Miss Marple nodded. And the timing? He drank it around 8:45 according to the maid's account, sat quietly in the garden by 9:10, dead before the service began. Miss Marple stirred her tea. She knew his habits, his vanity, that he insisted on dressing early, sipping tea alone in the drawing-room while rehearsing responses to imaginary conversations. Crail smiled faintly. You make him sound dramatic. He was, she replied without malice, but he wasn't the only one. 2 days later, Gwen Clark stopped by Miss Marple's cottage. She looked pale, but steadier somehow. A woman, walking lighter for the weight no longer pressed to her shoulders. I've been offered a position, she said, in Bath. Curator of a private collection. Not grand, but clean work. Quiet. Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea. You'll do well. Some places are kinder to silence than others. Gwen looked at her with faint amusement. You know I didn't really like Mrs. Lucius, don't you? She wasn't easy, vain, fragile. But she didn't deserve what happened to her. No one does, Miss Marple replied. That's what makes murder so universally shocking. It interrupts even the unpleasantness we've come to accept. She reached across the table and placed a small cloth-bound book beside Gwen's saucer. Was the diary Ruth Ellery had kept. Miss Marple had retrieved it from her emptied cottage, and Inspector Crail had agreed it would serve no purpose in court. "I thought you should read it," she said. Gwen hesitated, then tucked it into her bag. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not assuming the worst of me." "I rarely assume," Miss Marple said with a smile. "I observe. People always reveal more than they intend." By Friday, Daniel Wire had left the village. He had spoken very little to anyone, not even Miss Marple in the end. But he had left a note tucked into the garden wall of the Lucius cottage. It read, "I came for history and found pain, but thank you for helping me name it." It was unsigned, but Miss Marple recognized his hand. She watched from her garden as the last of the taxi's dust settled on the lane. Some ghosts, she thought, prefer not to be exorcised, only acknowledged. On Sunday, the church service resumed its full routine. The pews were filled again. The choir sang with renewed gusto. The bells rang clean and clear through the morning. But the third pew on the right remained empty. Miss Marple attended, as always, seated where she always had, quiet but watching. Afterward, Reverend Ames caught up to her by the lych gate. "You heard that?" "No," he said with a soft chuckle. "We're thinking of dedicating that pew to the fallen, not just in war, but those whose story